see. Thank you. That was indeed very welcoming. Yes, good to go. All right, so I don't remember when was the first time, but I've heard the saying that everything is connected at several points in my life. And I don't want to debate if literally everything is connected, but I have noticed that connections really are everywhere. They are a part of us, of the world, from connections between people, between cultures, within language and nature, some being literal connections, while others connect us across time, and yet others only exist through the meaning we as humans give them. And in these days, when more data is being collected every day than we could ever hope to explore, the variety in connections being gathered is opening up the possibilities to explore and visualize more of these complex networks and connections. So I've been focusing on data visualization for a few years now, and I like to take on the bigger data sets, those that have a lot of diversity, so I can show context and other stories besides the main insight. And ever since I started freelancing, I noticed that a lot of my projects can actually be seen as visualizing connections. Some subtle, some very obvious, some ending up as actual network visualizations, while yet others need a more subtle and different form to reveal the story within. And during this talk, I kind of like to take you through the design process of several of my favorite connected projects to kind of reveal the ugly truth that goes into creating these big and elaborate, data-driven and often interactive visuals and stories. So I want to start out with straightforward connections, literal lines that are being drawn, and only through those lines do the connections even exist, constellations. So officially, I am an astronomer. So I have an enormous bias for everything space. I'm often inspired by our universe for design elements in my visuals, and I also find myself creating a visualization about space every now and then. And for my final addition to a year-long personal collaboration project called Data Sketches, which I did together with Shirley Wu, also a data viz freelancer, I found myself going towards astronomy yet again. The topic was myths and legends, and through a winding road of ideas, I eventually went with one that was about myths in the night sky. Because sure, I can pinpoint my favorite constellations, but those are all from Western culture. And I was curious, what if other cultures seen in the night sky, across space, across time? Are there certain shapes that almost every culture identifies with? So I drew this tiny little sketch in my tiny little notebook, but in my mind, that little sketchy circle would eventually become something that would be a fully flat sky map, and it would be inspired by those amazing historic sky maps with all of the embellishments. Well, full of enthusiasm to get started, I kind of crossed my fingers, hoping that diverse cultural constellation data would be available online. That was kind of the crux. I wouldn't be able to gather that myself. Thankfully, I quickly stumbled upon Stellarium, which is a great free planetarium software, and even better, it's open source. So after some digging around, I found that they have constellation information about 28 different cultures. So taking that initial data preparation, I then looked up some examples of sky maps that were created with D3.js, which is generally the library that I use a lot to do my data visualizations with. And all of these examples didn't have a lot of code. I'm assuming D3 does a lot under the hood, but the actual code part was very little. So this was one of those very, very few cases where I felt like I copied over the example completely correctly and put in my own data, and then it would magically work on the first save and reload. Of course, real life happened, and they all appeared in a line. Yes. Well, that was something at least. Usually my first try is a blank screen. And then, realizing my mistake, they did appear all across the page, but by this time, no more confidence. I didn't know if this was just a happy coincidence or if they were in the correct place, so I just kept on going. Adding a background grid, and then the lines of Western culture that I know personally, and then I immediately noticed Orion, which is my personal favorite constellation. So stars were in the correct place. And in essence, this is already a sky map, but it is kind of a boring one. So I remembered what I really liked and what I wanted to do. So I added, for example, the colors of the stars, gave them a glow, added streaks for the background, in the background for the Milky Way, and remembering what I liked from those historic maps, such as the embellishments of the zodiac signs, the degrees, the ecliptic line, everything into a circle. And I'll spare you the details, but this is basically, at the end, how my basic sky map looked. And what would make my map different from the mainstream ones was the inclusion of several different constellations at once to reveal how different cultures had seen connections in the same scattering of stars. And I would do that by focusing on a single star and then visualizing all of the connections that had, sort of all of the constellations that used that one star. I started out by adding these mini donut charts around all of the stars that were part of all of these constellations, because of course, several stars are used by several constellations. Then I wanted to add parallel lines, one for each of these constellations. And as usual, I kind of draw out what I want to do in my little notebook, which I did here as well, trying to figure out how to get the formula for the right placement of the lines with trigonometry, sines and cosines. Wasn't really getting anywhere. And then I thankfully remembered just a little bit of linear algebra, and that the normal vector is actually a really easy way to do that. So I should brush up on my linear algebra. But that's how the parallel lines actually came about quite fast. And here is kind of the final result of my main visualization that shows all of the constellations that show the star Betelgeuse. And I thought it was so cool when I first saw this myself that so many of these constellations and cultures have that same hourglass shape. But of course, each culture sees something different in that shape, from animals to heroes to objects to mythical creatures. But I also like that there are always those that have it differently, such as this very interesting sort of man from the Navajo that I think that might be a bow or a boomerang. I honestly don't know what this interesting man from the Egyptians. Just kind of different. I also looked at the brightest star in the night sky, Sirius, but it actually doesn't have anything going on for it. There's no specific shape, and that's probably because I learned that to have a good constellation, you need several obvious stars that create a pattern and not just one bright star that overshines everything else. I found this incredibly cute deer-like shape in the southern hemisphere that I still hope to find one day with, in real life. And what seems to be the most recognizable shape across all of these cultures that I had in my data set is the one that most of us know as the Big Dipper. Although I'm sure there is a northern hemisphere bias in all of these cultures, but still. Here is the full article actually where I go through many more stars and look at the data in different ways to kind of reveal how people have seen their myths and legends and their connections in the night sky. And I was happily surprised that people seem to enjoy this part of the sky that they never really thought about, and eventually also turned it into a series of posters so people could sort of bring these connections back into their home. But I think when most people think about connections, they probably think about family ties. How are you connected to your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, and so on. And for another project of that Data Sketches collaboration, the topic was presidents and royalty. And I've always been intrigued by how intermarried the royals really are. Are they cousins twice removed, or is it closer or further than that? And I didn't just want the last few generations of one royal house so I could make something more traditional looking like this. No, I wanted as many connections as possible crossing royal houses. I was again in luck when I found a data set of 3,000 people connected to European royal families, all royal families going back more than a millennia. It came from this lovely looking website. So I definitely learned that website design doesn't say anything about data quality. It was from 1992, so I did have to spend an evening on Wikipedia adding one or two more generations in the main line of succession. The problem that I have with these heavily interlinked networks is that it's very hard to draw out anything less abstract than circles connected by lines. And that is because the best way to visualize a network is so inherent to the connections in the network. So what I usually do is, I always sketch out my designs, but with networks, I completely skip that phase, put all of my data on the screen, and then start with the most basic network kind of algorithm settings and go from there. I did that here as well, and I got this. Everything exploded out of my screen. So that wasn't really useful. I put in a little bit more gravity to try and rein things in a little bit, keep it in my screen. But then there was this tipping point, and I was left with a useless hairball. Coloring everybody by year of birth didn't help. But thankfully, in my browser, I can actually play with the laws of gravity. So I pulled this web apart by year of birth, which was better, but it was still a rather uninsightful bundle. And at this point, I'd actually already invested several hours into playing with the network settings, trying different kinds of connections and adjusting the data. And I was kind of ready to just give up and try a different angle, like how much are the royals spending these days? You know, how many hours do you have to work for like what our king makes in 1 minute? But I gave it one last shot. And that's when I decided to focus on the current royal leaders. So these are the bigger circles. I placed them in a line. And then I let the vertical gravity depend on which of these royal leaders you were most closely related to. And that's when I finally saw it, insights. For example, that the Queen of Denmark, England, and King of Norway are quite heavily interconnected, but that the Prince of Monaco line separated from Europe 200 years ago. And only once I felt like I had a handle on the visual form, did I start thinking about the visual design. And like I said, I have a bias for space, and networks often remind me of constellations, so I turned everybody into a little star. There's really no other reason. Here is the final result, where everything is rotated 90 degrees to better fit screens. And because I wanted to give people a way to sort of explore this network, I added 2 types of interactions. So the first is you can hover over anybody. For example, Pauline of Württemberg. I probably said that wrong. She is connected to 6 current royal leaders in only 6 steps. So that's what it shows. It shows you how far the 6 degrees of separation kind of reach into this web. And I can click on anybody, such as here we have the Queen of England, and here we have Sissy. And we can see the shortest path between these 2. So these 2 are maybe not that closely related, but the Queen of England and the King of Norway are actually family, if you didn't know. So through this project, I learned that the current royal families aren't really that closely related anymore. But you know, maybe 200 years ago, that was not necessarily the case. But thankfully, smart people figured out that it's not so healthy for you to marry your cousin. So I was introduced to the Guardian US by a mutual friend. Through the Gates Foundation, they have an entire section on their website focusing on homelessness in America. And for a flagship piece, they had been gathering data about bus tickets being given out to homeless people to move away from that city, from cities and shelters for over a year. And they were looking for someone to bring the insights from that data to life through visuals. And because I knew that was too big for me alone, I asked Shirley Wu from the Data Sketches collaboration to become my partner. Well, with my data science background, I actually took the data cleaning and analysis part on me. And all of these cities and shelters had sent over PDF files and Excel files, and of course each of them was completely different. However, the truly bad part came in the shape of typos and state errors. Because to properly know where a homeless person was moving to, I needed an existing city for each destination. And so, comparing against an official data set of US cities, I created a collection of fuzzy text matching techniques that would try and figure out the actual city in cases where an exact match wasn't found. I also spent hours on Google trying to find the actual city in cases where even the fuzzy matching wasn't able to know where that city was. And that's how I've realized that the US should never have created 4 states that start with the letters MI. Well, after all of that was done, I was left with 35,000 journeys. And so I got into the analysis phase. So I was creating tons of simple plots, dissecting the data in different ways, looking for trends and analyses. You know, what about age and gender? What about big versus small cities? What if, what destination was most popular, and what if you try to account for distance? And simply just visualizing all of these journeys, I knew would become an important aspect of the story. But just plotting all of these lines on a map didn't create for anything insightful or triggered anything for me. So I knew that needed a different visual styling. Well, partly due to lucky timing, everybody involved could be in the same room together for 2 days, during which we figured out the story we wanted to tell, and Shirley and I created visual designs for the visualizations that would support the different conclusions throughout the story. And my main one would be that map of the US showing all of these journeys. The design that I came up with was, instead of plotting all of these lines at once, I would make them animated. They would become these little streamlets moving from their starting point to the destination. And then over time, these circles would start to grow behind the cities to show how many of the homeless people had already moved there. Well, back home, I started creating the animation. Didn't really think about, how it might look. I just gave everybody the same starting time and ending time, refreshed my page, and then was kind of surprised to see that it was 10 little USs growing into the bigger one. It's kind of funky feeling. And giving everybody the same speed didn't really make it much better with these shockwaves moving across the US. So finally, making sure that everybody kind of held on to a timeline of when they actually left, because the bus tickets were date stamped, it looked a lot better. But I was still kind of curious to see how arcs might look, like lines. Of course, that took a few steps to get working, but I got there. Well, this was a little bit better than an initial sort of static image, but it wasn't a lot better, so I made them tiny. But then it was kind of weird that sometimes it seemed as if somebody was moving through Canada to go somewhere. So knowing that these arcs wasn't really a good thing, I went back to my Streamlits and I tried lots of things to add more details, such as being able to follow a person for a little while. But eventually we just decided to keep it very simple for just these people moving and nothing else was needed. And now let me see if I can remember the short key for switching tabs, because The Guardian doesn't allow iframing. Here's the article, and here we have the map. And what is happening here is something called scrolly telling. It's not a really good name. What happens basically is that the visualization stays in place and the text scrolls over it, and as sort of the visual updates to sort of fit with the text, what is being said in the text. So we're coming up to the animation now, yes. And what is happening here, really, what it tries to convey is sort of the sheer number of homeless people being bussed around the country, that they're going to places all over the US. And there are many more visualizations in this project. It's a big article, as well as photos and videos and interviews to really try and find a balance between the personal stories and the high-level insights that this rich data set gave us. So if you'd like to read it, you can actually just Googling for bust out should take you there. There we go. So for the next project, I want to look at the connections between cultures. So since 2003, UNESCO has been gathering and safeguarding an ever-growing list of intangible cultural heritage, which can be anything from practices, knowledge, and skills that people see as being part of their cultural heritage. And about 40 new elements get added each year, approximately, and the full list contains about 600 of them. And you can browse this list in this not so very inviting table on the UNESCO website. If you click one of these things, you get extra information as well as videos and photos. But there's something else here as well in the lower left called concepts. And experts of these cultural elements have extensively tagged each of them. And there are actually primary and secondary concepts, which will become important later on. Well, comparing all of these tags, all of these concepts across all of the cultural elements, it's probably no surprise that some concepts occur for more than one of them, such as vocal music being a part of all of these except for one. And one man within UNESCO had a vision where people would truly be able to see and interact with these connections, so that people would understand that you can have cultural elements that are very similar based on their concepts, no matter what culture or country they came from. He had convinced management, thankfully, to give him some funding, and he hired someone for the back end and was looking for someone to do the visualization. And he was very upfront in his first email to me about the scope of this network. So at the time, there were about 450 elements, some countries, projects, NGOs, and about 1,000 different concepts. And this combines to about 2,000 nodes, which is more of the technical term for entities or circles in a network. And between them, they shared a whopping 12,000 connections. And I have to admit, I wasn't sure I was ever going to be able to handle that. I mean, the royalty project only had 4,500 connections, and that already proved such a difficulty to tame. But I didn't want to say no to UNESCO, so I kind of just crossed my fingers, hoping that future me would figure it out. And yeah. Well, as with the royalty project, I knew that sketching was useless here, so I just plopped all of my data on the screen and continued from there. And as also totally expected, I ended up with hairballs. Giant virus-looking diseases kept appearing on my screen no matter what I tried, and I tried a lot. But there was one aspect of the data that saved me. Not all of these connections were of equal importance. So, for example, with these concepts, we have the tango, and dance and instrumental and vocal music are primary concepts, but it has a lot more secondary ones, such as choreography and emotions. And although UNESCO didn't want me to aggregate away any of these secondary connections, they were fine with me only using the primary ones to actually place all of the cultural elements in this network. So I temporarily only kept the cultural elements and the primary connections. Reloaded my page again and got this, so no longer a hairball. The yellow ones are the cultural elements, and I made all the concepts just really tiny so they wouldn't be in the way. And when I saw this, I thought that I could actually also see communities, which would be a great way to untangle this one step further. Because in network analysis, you talk about communities when you have groups of circles that are more highly interlinked to each other than they are to the rest of the network. Think about your LinkedIn connections. You probably have a tightly knit group of people from high school, maybe university, the different workplaces that you have. And again, smart people have made algorithms that can find these communities, and I can then use that information to give each community a different color. And I did that here, and some of the bigger groups are all kind of the same purple, but I was definitely seeing the potential. And now finally feeling that I was getting somewhere, I tried to add other things, such as all of these small concept circles. I actually wanted to scale them according to how many of the sort of connections they had, so that the bigger ones, the ones that are the most important, actually stand out. It also creates a little bit of visual diversity, so it's generally seen as more beautiful in the eyes if you have a little bit of diversity. But I could do a little bit better, because generally with network algorithms, they need a sort of a starting point. And if you don't supply it, it's going to place them randomly on the screen. And what you can then have is that you kind of get knots in your network because things are in the way of other things. And that was kind of happening here. But because of these communities, I knew what should belong together. So instead of randomly placing them, I placed them all in a circle around, so together in a circle. And only then did I let the network algorithm do its thing. And when I saw this, I thought, well, okay, so it's pretty cool that most of these circles stay very close to that initial point. They're kind of kept into their community, and only a few of them are kind of pulled towards other directions because they have more ambiguous connections. And that showed me that looking at this particular network from the angle of communities was thankfully a fitting way. So I put everything back in that I'd filtered out, placing them on the sort of average location of stuff that was there, running a second network algorithm, and so on, looking at different color palettes, still rainbow because it just had so many different groups, different shapes for every kind of entity, different shapes for a World Heritage Site, for a country, for a concept. And I kind of liked that if you zoomed in, that it reminded me of a schematic image of outer space. And my contact at UNESCO, without me saying anything, started calling this the constellation, which of course I totally accepted and didn't object against anything space. Well, having the circles figured out, it was time to look at the lines. How to handle 12,000 lines visually. Gray and straight seemed kind of boring to me, so I made them colored and curved. But yeah, 12,000 lines at full opacity is one big mess. So again, I had to iterate and play with that, not always working at the first. I eventually thought, well, actually, if somebody hovers over a particular circle, an entity, I'll give them all of the information. You know, the thick lines are the primary connections and the thin lines are the secondary ones. But then if somebody doesn't hover over anything in particular, I will only show them the primary connections because those are the ones that are the strongest, the most important. And there were 12,000 connections, but only about 300 primary connections. So that made a huge difference. But of course, the client wanted so much more. For example, if you hovered over a region, it should show all of the countries and then down to all of the elements. That you had to send a query to the visual, which would then fix all of these elements. That if you clicked on an element and fixed it, you'd still be able to hover over everything else. That you had to be able to zoom around, and if you zoomed in far enough, the photo should be able to show. And somehow there should also be a way for people to have a modal pop-up because they want even more information, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. But here's the final result. And the idea is kind of to have some sort of serendipitous search in a way. You might hover over a particular element. Let's go for this one. the Ask Carnival, and you can see what their connections are. For example, it's connections to horse and handicrafts and vocal music, but yeah, you can go, oh, handicrafts, I'm interested in that. And then you're taken to that part of the networking and see what is connected to this again. And then maybe it's, I'm not going to pronounce that. But Lila, it's another cultural element. And then maybe for this one you want to know more, you can get the modal. And then again, what is this connected to? To India, apparently, and rivers and costumes. And that's how it kind of tries to entice you to playfully walk through this network to finally give you the idea that in the end, everything is connected somehow. Thankfully, UNESCO was happy with the result, and they postponed the online launch to the day when the actual convention was, when new elements were being added. So that was pretty cool. It's for just this thing. So connections can also be found in our language, depending on how you look at sentences and similarities between sentences. And this is just one way of seeing connections in language. There are so many other different ways. So Google has been asking data visualizers to create data-driven stories using Google's data for a while now. And I was really excited when they reached out to me to ask me to do a second one. So I came up with a list of ideas. And there was one that really reached out, spoke to me and my contact at Google, and that was doing something about pets. So I've had a cat for a long time, and more recently, I now have these two cute little fluff balls wrecking my house. So I find myself on Google quite often to kind of search for some behaviors, like, is this okay? Is that normal? How do I get this to work? How do I stop them doing that? And I was wondering, how do people in general use Google to better understand their pets? And the approach was that I would get the most popular questions that ask why about cats. You know, why does a cat? Why does my cat? Why do cats? And a few more of these variations, and the same for dogs. And then kind of look for trends and patterns and quirky things in there and just turn it into a story. And I drew sketches about the different visuals that I wanted to make. And this is truly the sketch quality that I send to my clients, because I want things to be rough. And I don't want them to say, make that a little bit bluer. No, it's about the idea. And my main one was this sort of sentence tree, where I would take all of these sentences, break them apart, and kind of recombine them into a tree-like structure. Well, let me explain that a bit better, though. Eventually, I got 2,000 of the most commonly asked questions about cats. And from that, I can say, give me everything that has like as the first word. So why do cats like? Well, within this, there are 3 questions that have the word boxes as the second word. Might be hard to read. Why do cats like boxes? So I can combine that one step further. And I can do the same for all the other sentences and all the other similar words in this list. So create a tree, where I can build up a sentence by following a line from left to right. For example, why do cats like to go in the bathroom with you? Yes, that is actually very true. I guess many cat owners know. It's kind of awkward. This is taking up a lot of space. So I wanted to shorten all of these lines and make them sort of appear around that initial word like, but also have the circle size be scaled to the popularity of the question, because why do cats like boxes is apparently much more popular than why do cats like milk or fish. But this is just one tiny aspect of the data set, and I wanted to visualize everything at once in a similar way. So I started with a simple network again, trying to reveal these connections, but I also really had to make these circles kind of bigger, because I wanted to put in the words that each circle represented. That would make it so much easier for people to play with this if they knew, oh, that circle represents purr, that circle represents lick. But this was taking up so much space that you kind of lost the connections, because they became gray blurs going outward. It was totally not clear who is the parent circle and who are the children. And after this point, I kind of tried everything I could think of to make these connections more clear, such as grouping all of the children of the same parent together. But then who was the parent? I still couldn't see that. It's still gray blurs towards the parents. And I would often have just weird stuff happening where I didn't know what was going on. For example, I still do not know why these circles start rotating faster and faster. I literally had to undo in my script until it just stopped doing this, and it didn't make any sense. And it would just pop up, after a few hours, it was there again. And if I had bigger ideas, I would first draw them out in my notebook to see if it made sense, spend hours actually making it happen, and sometimes it would be a little bit better, a little bit less chaotic, but it was never to that point where I felt that people would want to explore. It always felt like an overload. And the things would just be chaos sometimes. And I tried so many different things over and over again, just to try to see, can I somehow make this data feel like people want to explore it? In the end, I actually even made stuff draggable, so I could manually drag each circle exactly where I thought I wanted it. And it took me about 2 hours to do the right-hand side, and took a step back, and it was still, no, it still does not feel right. So 40 hours after having started with that initial network did I give up. But I still had to visualize this data somehow. It was a client project. So I thought back on everything that I tried during those 40 hours and remembered that at some point I'd actually cut the connection to that central cat circle so that each branch would become its own mini tree. Of course, that didn't go right the first time either. I could say this is art, it's like abstract art. But I remember thinking that these mini trees, now in retrospect, looked a lot more interesting than whatever I tried with that bigger circle. So I wanted to keep this. And I thought, well, I don't want them to sort of bunch together. So they should be really separated. So I want to draw each of them in their own separate circle. And what I'm doing now in the end is that based on the tree, the number of things in the tree, I guess an initial sort of radius that it should contain. And then I just plot them on the page randomly. I run a non-overlapping algorithm that kind of pushes everything aside, takes up as much height as it needs. And then within each of these circles, I run a separate little network algorithm. You can see some of the bigger ones. But of course, this doesn't really need to be animated. It only slows down the page. It's horrible. So all of this is done under the hood with web workers. And in the end, you just get a page full of mini trees. And when I saw this, and I was probably biased, 40 plus hours after starting, but I felt like I'd finally found a good middle ground between giving people access to all of the data while hopefully not being too overwhelming. Also, then I really spent time with the design to make it really whimsical and colorful and sketchy so that people would kind of be invited to want to move their mouse over this, like, oh, what's going on? Oh, hey, look, oh, stuff is happening, stuff is animating, and then be interested in what it was actually showing. Why does my cat lick my hand and bite my nail? There's so much fun stuff here. There's something about, eating fake Christmas trees and sad stuff, such as why does my cat, hate me? So sad. But of course, there were many more visuals in this project, so the process started all over again. I went through I don't know how many color palettes and font choices. I had to sort of write every text. I had to figure out the layout of the page. And then, of course, things had to be differently on mobiles versus desktop. The visuals sometimes had to behave differently. The interactions behaved differently, really exploding the underlying complexity. It's like, from a personal perspective, I'm really happy that we have smartphones. But from a freelance perspective, I'm really not happy that we have smartphones. They make my life, they really suck. No, they don't. And interactive search boxes. But again, let me quickly show you the final result. We can show cats and dogs, but cats. And I try and ease people in. First with some more simple visualizations about, the likes and dislikes. We had the whole cucumber meme, and people started looking a lot for that. Why do cats are afraid of cucumbers? The sounds that they make, and the sleeping that they do. And then finally, I feel like, okay, now you're ready to see it all. And that happens over here. But I also found that there's actually an interesting thing about what people ask about cats in general and what they ask about my cat. The things they ask about my cats are throwing up and smelling and drooling and sneezing, things like you have to be close to a cat to actually sort of know that. And of course, ending with cats versus dogs. And the same then also for dogs. And this was a really fun project. I think this is the biggest project I've done since. Because I just love this data set so much that I kept on expanding and expanding on it. And I want to end with actually stepping away from connections that relate to humans and looking at systems instead. So I got approached by Alice, which is a startup from South Africa. And they are trying to use machine learning to find good investment opportunities. And to do this, they've created their own operating system, and they were looking for someone to visualize that system. So as a little bit of background on their data, each data point is a service, some task that is being run, which can be something as simple as copying a file to running an entire predictive model. And each of these services falls into a domain, such as all file handling services and all machine learning services. And each of these services and tasks, they can create others as well, which can create others as well. So there's an entire hierarchy of services having created others. And Alice kind of wanted me to visualize that. They said they wanted something that could be used for management purposes. So give an overview of the system, show the dependencies of all these tasks, and show us where things are going wrong. But it should also be used for marketing ends. So it should look pretty, be in line with their brand, which was very black, white, and red, and these long exposure photos of car lights. But as a data visualizer, having just white and black and red is very limiting. So I knew that was going to be quite a challenge. But the reason why they reached out to me was that they felt that the royalty project could fit perfectly with their data. So in that case, we have time was on the vertical axis, date of birth, and then the horizontal one pulling this network apart was the leaders. And they found that in their case, you can have creation time on the vertical, and then the domains would be the thing that kind of pulled the network apart. And the way they explained it seemed to make sense. So I set out to create it, but then when I had it working, it was clear that no, this was not working for Alice's data. So there were some domain crossings, but it didn't really happen that often. And the bigger problem really was that a lot of these services would create others within seconds from each other. So you had like groups of tens or hundreds of these small dots that all wanted to be in the same location, creating these blob-like things. I thought, well, maybe I can make it look into a giant spiral so that you have a really long time axis, but no, that wasn't really going anywhere. So I emailed my client, explained the situation, and said, I really need to take a step back and go into a proper design phase. So over the next 3 days, I sketched out an idea, and I would spend the next few hours programming it with Alice's data, such as starting out simple with a circle where everything was grouped by domain, and then chronologically, maybe something with spokes, where each spoke was its own domain, but you get something weird if one domain was much bigger than the others. Networks, but then I saw 7 little hairballs, so that was quickly tossed out. A radial trees, and you could really see the task dependencies here. So that was very interesting. However, the thing it couldn't really show was if a service from one domain created another service in another domain. That wasn't possible, so I couldn't really continue with this. Going back to the spokes, but making them sort of spirals to save space, but now the data was just going everywhere. Also circle packing with children within parents within children. I was, running out of ideas at this point. And after those 3 days, it was obvious to me that no existing chart form was working on this data set. So I looked back at the ones, what have I created and which ones do I like? And that was that initial sort of circle where things were grouped by domain and then chronologically, and that radial tree where the task dependencies were very obvious. So I thought, well, maybe I can combine them. In that case, I would actually create something I called a depth circle, where any child was moved one step further outward than its parent. So these two are very similar. All of the surfaces are around the same, at the same angle around the tree. But any child is moved one step further outward than its parent. And I sent this to the client, and thankfully they liked it, so I can continue to make it more on brand, such as making the tasks that are running and the ones that failed, making them glow. And I also wanted to have these lines connecting them be more like these street car lights, so I drew several different lines on top of each other, each slightly jiggled. But it took me some steps to figure out a formula that would kind of work with both short lines and long lines, but got there eventually. And here you can, for example, see how domain crossing would work, where a service in one domain creates a service in another. And then I had to make it animatable and updatable and interactive. So here is the final result. You can hover over a certain domain and see what's going on, get some metadata, or hover over a specific surface, and see that 2 steps down it actually failed because this one failed over here, which sort of cascaded back up. You can click on any domain to get more deeper insight, like details on demand. You can also go to a different time frame, which kind of uses a similar animation to show a possible overlap between the time frames. And so, yeah, I was really happy that I managed to make something out of this data set, especially looking at how dreadful that initial idea looked. Because, again, one of these things where I learned that the best way to visualize a network is so inherent to the connections within that network. And it doesn't stop there. I mean, there are connections within the organizational structure of companies. There are different kinds of connections between people, so many. I mean, besides families, such as friends or lovers, there are connections across time of the same person, such as visualizing all of the fights that the characters of Dragon Ball Z have appeared in. Very niche. And what I hope to have shown you is that connections can just be amazingly diverse. And I've found that visualizing the insights that lie within requires a very creative and custom and iterative approach. And yes, there are certain data sets of connections that are simple enough and straightforward enough that you can design more than just circles connected by lines at the start. You can actually draw at something. But usually I find that they are just too elusive and unknown and complex, and that there's nothing else for me to do but just put everything on the page, all the data, and then continue to design with code. So I can see the effects of every of my design choices on all of the data simultaneously and see how the network kind of behaves and evolves. Well, if you want, you can actually find all of these projects and ones that I didn't even have time for on my portfolio page. And finally, thank you very much for your attention.